I know some people treat Craigslist like any old thrift store, but the last time I used Craigslist was the last time I was desperately close to rock bottom. My crazy ex-girlfriend I somehow thought I was gonna marry had just thrown me out of the house and trashed just about everything I owned. So at that point, all I had in life was my truck and my buddy's house. The first place I went after she broke up with me was the bar, but then it was his place right after. Unfortunately, he had a roommate already, and they were both kinda bare-bones type of guys, so I ended up passing out on their living room floor since they didn't have a couch I could lay on. In the morning, my buddy woke me up and said I could stay as long as I needed to, but I wasn't allowed to keep sleeping on the ground. The only thing he wanted in exchange was for me to use my truck to help him move a couch into the house. I said deal, and a few hours later, we were heading out to some random guy's house to pick up a couch. I've never cared for the concept of Craigslist, as I was always too paranoid to use it, but at that point in time, I couldn't have cared if I tried. When we got to the house, I was disappointed to see that it kinda looked like a junkie's house, but my friend reassured me that the listing said the couch was basically brand new. I didn't believe him until I saw the couch though, and he was right as far as I could tell. It still smelled like factory chemicals, but the guy though, he was exactly the sort of seller on Craigslist that always made me never want to use the website in the first place. Definitely some kind of junkie by the level of crust. Real twitchy and greasy, with nasty ass teeth and a strong odor to him. But none of that's even the worst part. He said a lot of really weird things, most of which I don't remember, but there was one thing he said to us that seemed like a joke, but even in the moment, it gave me the creeps. You know, he said, "You two guys aren't the customers I wanted, but money's money." He didn't say it outright, but he made it obvious. He would have preferred it if my buddy and I had been two girls he could have tried to mess with instead of two men. Clearly though, he was an opportunist and he needed the $40 for a hit of something and he didn't really care. My buddy and I brushed him off and we hauled the couch into the back of my truck, then got the hell out of there, cracking jokes about the guy all the way home until we got the couch in the house. After another night of drinking myself blind at the bar, we staggered back home and I passed out on my new bed. When I drink like that, I don't wake up for at least 8 hours. However, that night was different. I couldn't tell why at first, but somewhere around 4 in the morning, my eyes peeled open and I couldn't get them to shut again. I had a pounding headache from all the whiskey, so I got up to drink some water. I staggered into the kitchen, poured myself a glass, and I was drinking it down. And I heard something. Maybe it was the house creaking, I thought, but I wasn't sure what my buddy's house sounded like yet. The wind sounded like it was picking up outside too. Lots of leaves were rustling. Actually, no, I thought again. That's got to be a raccoon or a possum or something making all that noise. I couldn't help myself from investigating though, it's in my blood. My buddy keeps his trash can in a little area right behind his front fence gate, which ran along the outside facing wall of the living room. There were a couple of windows, so I thought I'd peek outside to try to see what kind of critter it was. But when I looked, it was that goddamn junkie creep that sold us the couch. He was crouched down right outside the window like he was trying to look for a way into the house. He even had the audacity to smile. "Enjoying the couch?" he said through the glass. I banged my fist against the window and let him have it. "Get out of here, you son of a bitch. You're messing with the wrong house," I said. The man scattered as soon as I raised the alarm, and my housemates poked their heads out of their rooms to ask what was up. But when I told them, they just shrugged and went back to sleep. I stayed up all night waiting for him to come back, cursing myself for not realizing that the guy was following us home. We were lucky he didn't try his luck while we were at the bar. When my roommate woke up, I made him help me take the stupid couch back to the curb, and I told him I'd just buy one from the store. But wouldn't you know it, about 30 minutes later, I glanced outside, and who else do I see but the waste of flesh, some waste of space friend of his, and a beat-up old truck, taking their couch right back. That pissed me off. I realized we fell straight into their plan. Their plan was to rob us the whole time, and since it hadn't worked out, they took their bait back. I just hope whoever buys it next doesn't turn out to be the girls that weirdo wanted. I remember the weirdest thing that happened to me from using Craigslist. I had just moved out and I was living in a house off campus with 3 other roommates from the small college I was going to. It was a cramped living situation, but it was actually really fun. The other guys were super cool and they'd been there for a year already, so the living room was decked out with a bunch of awesome stuff. It might sound funny, but I felt a little outdone when I compared my bedroom to the other guys. It's not like I'm super into interior design, but as a freshman in college, I felt like I needed to consider what would happen if I brought a girl into my room and it was dry as hell with little else but a mattress and a desk. I didn't want to embarrass myself by seeming like I didn't have any interest, so I knew I had to get some cool stuff like my roommates. Some of them were musicians, so they had guitars and band posters and cool art on their walls. I wanted to go for something like that, but I didn't know how to play, so I had to look into other things to avoid looking like a poser. I started using Craigslist, and I had great luck with it at first. I managed to pick up a few things that made my room feel more homey, but it was still missing something. And that's when I saw it. An old lady was basically giving away her entire record collection, and good records too. Tons of original classics. I didn't even have a record player, but I hopped on it straight away. I can get a player later, I thought, but this deal won't last, so I reached out and I ended up in contact with her son, who made the post. The very same day that I saw the sale, I was driving out to go pick it up. They lived on the far outskirts of town, and when I arrived, I saw a gravel driveway leading to a front yard full of junk and a double-wide trailer in the back of the lot. I was a little put off, but I wasn't about to let that deter me. Parked out front and knocked on the door, where a few seconds later I was greeted by the son. He was wearing the outfit of a textbook hillbilly, and from the structure of his face and the sound of his voice, I could tell that his family had probably been doing a little inbreeding in the area for many generations. But again, I guess that wasn't a problem for me. We talked outside for a minute before he invited me in. I expected the place to be a smelly mess based on the outside, and I was right. But I kept my eyes from prying. He led me to the living room where his mother was sitting in her chair. A rocking recliner that was covered in tons of blankets, and was definitely her chair that she sat in a lot. I sat in the sofa across from her as her son posted up in the doorway, leaning against the frame. The old lady started to ask me why I wanted the records, and I admitted that I didn't know too much about them, but that I was looking to get into it as a hobby. Then she asked if I had any questions, and I couldn't help but ask why she was selling her collection at such a low price. That's when things became disturbing. The old lady paused and looked at her son with a creepy smile. Then she looked back to me, and she said she had to admit that she hadn't been being totally honest with me. She was willing to sell me the record, she said, but there was an additional cost that hadn't been mentioned. I asked her what she meant by this, and she looked back at her son. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine, and I looked over my shoulder at the man, noticing now that he was eyeing me like a piece of meat. What's worse, he was blocking the only way out of the living room. I instinctively rose to my feet, and I backed away right as he tried to grab me and sit me back down. The old lady kept talking in the background, like she was trying to convince me to go with this. He gets so lonely, she said, and he does everything for me. This is all he ever talks about wanting, so I have to repay him for everything he's done. I started yelling at them and calling them both crazy, but the old lady's son was still approaching me. He was taller than me, bigger than me, and with that inbred strength, I didn't think I had any way of winning against him in a fair fight. My only potential advantage was that he looked pretty slow. But you know what? I'm not naive enough to go into that fight with a fairness in mind. And I didn't go to a stranger's house completely unprepared. And it's probably the weakest defense ever, but every time I went to pick something up off of Craigslist, I heard my older brother's voice telling me to just take a pocket knife if nothing else, so I always did. The inbred creep was about to turn me into a dungeon slave and was already just a few feet away from me. I didn't bother pulling out the knife and telling him to back off. I knew if I did that, he would just rip it out of my hands. I had to take him by surprise. So I flicked out the blade and immediately I plunged it into his side. I hit him in the side of his ribs, which made my hand slip, and I sliced my finger open on the blade. But I managed to get the blade about 2 inches deep, right into his lung. At the end of my attack, I pushed him away as well. He was stunned, and honestly, so was I. I remember the look in his face, like he was about to cry or go berserk. But I didn't stick around too long to find out. I left the knife sticking out of his chest and slipped through the momentary window and sprinted past him. not looking back until I got into my car and locked the doors. I didn't care about not getting the records anymore. They were worth a lot, but what they wanted was a price I wasn't willing to pay for. I took a break from Craigslist after that, and I've never been back to it since. The silver lining to this story is that I've had good luck with showing off my scar on my finger and telling the whole story of how I got it. Craigslist isn't as popular as it used to be. These days, people would rather use Facebook Marketplace, and from what I've seen, that looks like a good thing. With everything being on Facebook, you're able to know the person better, and if things go wrong, the wrongdoer can easily be held accountable. Although, I wouldn't know from personal experience, as I've never used the service anyway. But years ago, I was an active seller on Craigslist, but then something happened that made me swear off in-person meetings with people from the internet for good. I was 29 years old when this happened, and for the last couple of years, I've been using this site to sell off all the antiques and knickknacks I've been collecting since college. I formed a weird obsession with old-fashioned things when I quit drinking and partying with my sorority all the time. But the clutter was starting to become its own problem, so I had to get rid of it. I lived alone, but in a close-knit condo community, so I never felt unsafe, even when internet strangers came by to take stuff out of my home. However, this stopped being the case one day when I thought I was finally going to sell the biggest and most expensive thing I owned. This ornate, solid wood dresser that weighed a ton. It was a beautiful piece, but it had taken 2 burly mover men to get it inside, so I knew it would take that sort of manpower to get it out. I talked to one of the guys over the phone, and he said he would be bringing his friend who had a van that was large enough to fit the dresser in. I said that was fine, and they agreed to get there around 3 p.m. But then 3 o'clock rolled on, and then it was 3:30, then 4 o'clock. And when I tried calling them for the first time, they didn't answer, and that went on and on. The minutes and hours ticked away until it was almost 8. It was past dark by then, and I'd pretty much given up on them. But then, they finally knocked on the door. I answered with a bit of an attitude, understandably, but they apologized profusely and made a bunch of excuses about how they had to use the van for work or something. And they cried that they didn't get out of work until 7, but then I stopped them mid-sentence, and I said that it was fine as long as they got the dresser out. They looked like contractors, so I wasn't sure what they wanted with a fancy dresser, but I figured they planned to flip it to a boutique store and repeat the antique lifestyle or something. I invited them inside and showed them to my room where the dresser was. They gave it a slight lift to see how heavy it really was, and they both took a step back in surprise, like they severely underestimated it or something. That's when one of them admitted that he had to quickly use the bathroom before he lifted something that heavy. I sighed and rolled my eyes a bit, but I graciously showed him to the bathroom. I walked him down to the hall to the door, and I opened it for him, but he didn't walk in. He didn't even hesitate. He just suddenly grabbed me and dragged me into the bathroom. I managed to let out a small scream before he threw me on the floor where I hit my head against the tub. When I looked up, I saw that the other man was walking in behind him, and now they were both standing over me. I was dazed and confused, and even though I could see, I couldn't coordinate myself to fight or run. I was terrified. It seemed like life as I knew it was about to be completely destroyed. I could still remember the whole body sensation of dread, just wishing I could die instead of going through what was about to happen. They dug their hands through my pockets and took everything out, then grabbed my wrists and ankles to tie them together with zip ties, before finally putting a strip of duct tape over my mouth. This is it, I thought. But then just when it seemed like the worst was about to happen, they both left and shut the door. I was so confused, but also more worried than anything that they would come back to throw me in the van, but they never did. I literally spent 3 or 4 hours in that bathroom, immobilized and bleeding from the head, slowly shaking off the head trauma until I was finally able to use my tongue to get the duct tape off, just enough that I could start screaming for help through it. At last, one of my neighbors heard me through the walls and called the cops. And what they found, aside from me in the bathroom, was my entire condo ransacked for every valuable thing in my possession that those men were able to carry off into their van. Excluding the giant dresser, of course. According to the security camera at the front entrance, the van was completely unmarked, without even a license plate, and since there was no footage of the men themselves, I was told from the get-go that the police would probably never find them, and of course, they never did. It's been over 10 years since that night, and I've lived with the trauma ever since. Still wonder if the fact that all they did was take everything I owned is something I should be grateful for somehow. Because let's be honest, they could have done much worse, and I'm just glad they didn't. I guess nobody can really predict the minds of criminal lowlives. I used to run with this chick that was a little unstable, to say the least. She'd probably kill me if she heard what I was about to say using her real name, so for my own sake, I'm going to refer to her as Jane. To make a long backstory short, she came from a messed up family, and her dad was sort of at the center of a lot of her problems. When he finally died, she told me she went to the funeral just so she could find out where he was buried. A few days later, in the middle of the night, Jane called to ask me to take her to the cemetery to smash his gravestone. Although that was something I would never do to anyone, no matter how much I hated them, I could understand why Jane would want to do something like that against her father's memory. She didn't have a license, so I picked her up and we drove to the cemetery. When I parked the car in the visitor lot outside, she pulled a hammer and a handful of grocery bags out of her purse. She said she just wanted to go in, smash it up into a bunch of small pieces, bag it up, and leave. Obviously, I knew that we were breaking at least one law by trespassing into the cemetery after dark, but this was alright with me, and I just told her I would keep an eye out for anyone in the area while she did what she needed to do. On that note, we got out and we hurried over to the grave. Jane knew exactly where it was, so it took us no time at all. But I was still extremely nervous about the whole thing. It wasn't just the threat of being arrested, but the vibe of the cemetery itself. It really felt like I wasn't supposed to be there, like we were disturbing all those dead people by marching through in the middle of the night. I kept my head on straight and I tried to give Jane space. At first, she spent a minute kneeling on top of the relatively fresh grave, whispering a bunch of curses and crying, just from the sheer intensity of whatever emotion she was feeling. But then, without warning, she started screaming. She started striking the headstone for the first time. It caught me so off guard that it sent chills through my whole body. I spun around and I was about to tell her to quiet down, but at first glance, I knew she wasn't going to hear me. She was going absolutely berserk on this stone, screaming and wailing at the top of her lungs. Each time she hit it with the hammer, only a small piece would break off. I realized we were going to be there for a while if it went on at this pace, and she was making so much god-awful noise that I was terrified that somebody in the nearby neighborhood would hear us. I also thought about how blood-curdling it would feel to be walking by the graveyard and hear Jane's banshee-like shrieking in the distance, and to be unsure if she was like a ghost or a serial killer or something. My instincts set in, and I became more concerned about my own safety than anything else. Here was this completely unhinged crazy person, violently thrashing their way through a mixture of grief and unhealed trauma, seeing red with total tunnel vision, and I was alone with her, surrounded by darkness and dead people. I was worried that if I got near her, she would forget it was me and think I was the ghost of her father and start trying to kill me or something, so I backed away. However, it wasn't long before the deep-seated rage within Jane started to wear off a bit and she became tired. She then stopped and she looked at the progress that she made. 2/3 of the headstone was still intact, but she was already exhausted. That's when she looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw the look of unveiled insanity in Jane's eyes. I'd always known Jane had a few screws loose, but this was next level crazy. All her movements were sudden and jarring. She stood and shoved the hammer into my chest, telling me to take it and finish the job. I protested at first, not wanting to get roped further into what I thought was Jane's thing she needed to do. But as soon as I did, she grabbed me by the ears and yanked my head down so that my face was less than an inch away from hers. She then screamed so loud that it practically ruptured my eardrums. She demanded that I break the gravestone for her, or she'd use the hammer on me and bury my body next to her father's. Seeing that I was in too deep to back out, I reluctantly accepted the task and committed myself to making short work of it. Of course, I was stronger than Jane, but I wasn't nearly as uninhibited. What happened next, though, made me all the more sure that I shouldn't have tried to fight her or anything. As I was hacking away at the stone, managing to break off bigger pieces, she was standing behind me, laughing like an absolute maniac. She was cheering me on the way I imagined a witch would encourage another witch to their first human sacrifice. I tried my best to ignore her, but it was impossible. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that she pulled out a knife, which sent another chill down my spine. Before I knew it, she knelt behind me and straddled my back, throwing her arms over my shoulders, whispering literal pure evil into my ears. I froze up and stopped swinging the hammer because I didn't want to hit her. She told me I was almost done, then she did something I'll never forget. Both of her hands were out in front of me, one of which held the knife. Right before my eyes, she put the blade to her palm and sliced it open, creating a fountain of blood which quickly spilled down her wrist. Then she whispered some kind of satanic blessing in tongues and smeared her bloody hand over my face, from my forehead down to my chin, then across my throat, until she finally rested her hand with a vice grip at the base of my neck. She asked me if I could taste the blood, and I said I could. She took pleasure in this, and then she finally let go of me to stand on the grave again. Then she screamed out at the top of her lungs that these would be the final tears she would ever cry over her father. As she looked up into the night sky with her eyes open, she put her hand up to the moon and clenched her fist, squeezing the wound to form drops of blood which fell down upon her eyes and face. I watched this whole thing, stunned out of my mind, until she looked back at me with her face full of bloody tears and growled at me to finish the job. Of course, I was thoroughly terrified of Jane by this point and I was ready to leave. But I just did as she said. At last, when the whole thing was smashed to bits, I convinced Jane that we needed to go. Thankfully, she seemed ready, but the entire time we were picking up the pieces and bagging them, she was giggling. When it was all cleaned up, we ran back to my car, somehow going through this whole entire ordeal without anyone seeing or calling the cops on us. I drove Jane back home and I dropped her off. As she got out of my car, she tried to drag me out to spend the night with her. I'd been waiting for that night for months, but by then, I knew where that would go, and I knew it would be no good for me, so I made up some excuse about having to work the next day. In the morning, I cut off all contact, and I've been avoiding her out of fear ever since. I'll never forget when I worked nighttime security at a cemetery for about 2 weeks. It was never something I wanted to do as a security guard, but I didn't have a choice. The agency I worked for forced me to transfer due to an incident where I allegedly assaulted a kid who happened to have rich parents while doing my job. I'm not allowed to talk about that case though, so I won't. I didn't want to work at a cemetery for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, my boss told me to accept the transfer or resign from the agency, and I wasn't ready to be out of a job. The cemetery in question was the oldest in the city and it was considered historic. However, it just signed a contract for nighttime security after a couple of grave robberies that had recently occurred. It only happened twice in recent history, but in the span of a couple weeks, which indicated that it might happen again. Aside from the daytime toll booth workers, I was the first security guard to work there, which meant I had nobody before me to tell me how things might go. I couldn't sit still the first night, so I made a lot of walkabouts through the burial grounds in an effort to desensitize myself from how damn spooky it was in the dark. It had the opposite effect, though. At one point, I came across one of the graves that had been robbed. It was already refilled, although the grass hadn't been recovered yet. The marker was eroded, but I could tell that it was a woman who had lived to be pretty old. I paid my respects and I walked on without thinking much of it. Over the course of a few nights, nothing happened. It was one of the more boring starts to a job that I've had. I was used to getting off work around 4 or 5 a.m. at the latest, but I was in the graveyard from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. 3 nights a week, and that schedule didn't suit me. I became extremely drowsy halfway through each shift, and the coffee available in the booth was like water to me. When I went back for my second round of shifts, I was already over it. There was nobody around to notice though, so I didn't care. I was through with my first week, so I figured my supervisors would be more lax about watching over the camera footage. Instead of trying to force myself to stay awake when I was exhausted and nothing was happening, I let myself sleep when I felt like it. I didn't think the grave robbers would actually come back and try their luck for a third time once they knew I was there. And it's not like I had a problem stealing company time from the agency that screwed me over. However, there was one party who had a problem with me sleeping on the job. The last night I worked there, I was exhausted from the previous shifts, and it didn't take too long for me to start dozing off in my chair. I actually fell into a deep enough sleep to start dreaming. I don't remember how the dream started, but I know that at some point it suddenly became a nightmare. I had laid down thinking I was about to get a massage or something, only to feel an immense pain in my stomach. I screamed and I opened my eyes to see a gaunt elderly woman standing above me with a shovel, plunging it into my abdomen and digging out my insides. I couldn't move, and all I could do was watch her eviscerate me. It was the most vivid dream that I've ever had. Luckily, I was able to force myself awake. I opened my eyes with a start. Then, right there on the other side of the booth window, I saw that same decrepit old woman staring right at me. I jumped back and I fell off the chair, losing sight of her for a second. When I got to my feet, she was gone, but I was thoroughly shaken. I was terrified by the thought of going out there, but I knew it was my job to go looking for anyone who attempted to trespass, and to be honest, I didn't feel any safer being a sitting duck in the toll booth. I stepped outside into the cold under a full moon and turned on my flashlight, throwing the beam in every direction. At first, I didn't see anyone, but then my heart skipped a beat when I saw a figure standing near the back of the property by the trees. I shouted at them, but they didn't respond. I had to look away for a second as I heard rustling in the bushes behind me, but it was thankfully just a possum that I startled into running off. That was logical and reassuring, although there was still that mysterious figure standing by the woods. But of course, when I looked back, she was gone. I couldn't understand how such a frail old woman was covering so much ground. But I marched over to where I last saw her without thinking about it. I had to walk across the entire graveyard to get to the back of the property. Along the way, it seemed like every single creature in the woods was going insane. I heard flocks of birds suddenly take flight from all the trees at once, right as an owl let out one of those awful screeches that they make. Even a pack of coyotes started to go haywire in the distance. It felt like all the forces in nature were warning me not to keep going, but in my gut, I was worried that if I stopped walking that something else would happen. So I pressed on until I finally got to the edge of the graveyard. I looked around with a flashlight and called out to the person I saw, but I didn't see or hear anyone. Then, as quickly as it all had started, all the noises in the woods stopped. Every single animal fell silent. Even the bugs went quiet. I muttered to myself in confusion and I started to turn around. But that's when I noticed I was standing right on top of one of the graves that had been robbed. The one of the old woman that I'd seen the week before. As soon as I realized this, I felt stiff hands wrap around my throat and my feet were kicked out from under me. I couldn't see who was doing this to me, but they were strong as hell. They bashed my face into the recently replaced dirt probably a dozen times, until it started to feel like I was about to pass out from lack of oxygen. Then at the last second, it stopped. I felt the rough touch of the hand simply disappear. I quickly got to my feet in a panic, but I couldn't see anyone in the area. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing, but there was no way that I could have. It felt as real as anything else. Whatever it was had me chilled to the bone. I didn't finish my shift that night. I ran to my car with my tail between my legs and I quit the job on the spot. This event has haunted me ever since. I've pieced together what it meant over the years. The spirit of the old woman who was robbed didn't take kindly to me slacking on the job, and she took matters into her own hands to make sure it never happened again. I've never been a superstitious person, but sometimes things happen in life that make you reevaluate your assumptions. Even now, when I'm at work and I feel myself getting the urge to slack off, I see that woman out of the corner of my eye for a split second, reminding me of the lesson she taught me. I've never told this story to anyone. I know I shouldn't even do so anonymously at the risk of being connected to it, but it's been eating at me for decades. It happened when I was a kid. I was about 13 years old and it was the night of Halloween. I lived in a relatively new suburb at the time, which had been built to increase the number of homes in the small town that was growing adjacent to the freeway. It all looks very different now, but back then, the area wasn't nearly as developed. Strangely, Nowhere was this more obvious than the cemetery that was a few turns off the main road in what used to be the outskirts. At the time, it was mostly vacant, as not enough people had died to fill it up yet. That would change, however, as me and my two friends, who I'll protect by calling Aaron and Michael, decided we wanted to go exploring the empty graveyard instead of trick-or-treating. We knew it would get us in trouble, so we put in some effort to cover our tracks. We wore costumes and started the night by immediately stealing a few bowls of candy that were set out and mixed in all together, so it would look as though we actually went trick-or-treating, like our parents thought. Then we walked about a mile off the beaten path so we could get to the cemetery without being seen by the cars in the main road. This involved hopping a fence that surrounded a large drainage pond for the freeway and cutting across the banks to hop the fence again into the cemetery grounds. As we got off the residential streets, we were bathed in darkness, which meant there was almost no chance that we would be seen. We thought we were safe, but what we didn't know was that we were being followed. Once we had successfully snuck in, we stomped around and tried to scare each other for laughs. Then we found a few blank gravestones laying around next to a crypt, and we smashed them together just because we could. We took a few chunks as souvenirs. There wasn't much else for us to get up to, though. The whole place was eerily empty. We were used to seeing them filled to the brim with gravestones, but the majority of this space was just uninterrupted grass. Eventually we got bored, but we weren't ready to leave, so we sat down against the backs of a few gravestones to avoid sitting on top of dead people. There was a view of the freeway that looked pretty cool, since it was the only thing that was lit up for miles. For a moment, we were just sitting there being kids. Then it all came crashing down as we heard what sounded like a person behind us. We all jumped in fright, and we turned around, but we couldn't see anything. Just gravestones. The ghastly wailing continued, and then it started to say our names. We shouted at it, trying to claim we weren't scared of it, but we were. We thought we were totally alone, so maybe it was a ghost that was mad at us for being there when we were supposed to. We started walking towards it with small terrified steps, hoping we would look behind one of the gravestones and see a person messing with us. All three of us were clutching broken chunks of granite, as if it would help defend us from the supernatural. When we started getting closer, it seemed like we were localizing the source of the noise. That's when it said something that I wished it wouldn't have every single day. For context, my friend Aaron's mother was extremely ill with cancer at the time. That's part of the reason that we were acting out by breaking into the cemetery in the first place. He was in a funk and he was mad at the world, and he was our friend that we did stuff with. Understandably, Aaron stopped in his tracks when the voice claimed that it was the ghost of his mother. I can't imagine what was going on through his head. A lot of powerful mixed emotions that must have been a lot for a 13-year-old to handle. He shouted back, trying to cast doubt, but he was already choking up. The supposed ghost of his mother dug deeper, saying that she just died a few minutes ago. Aaron said that was a lie, but the voice didn't care. It started to cry and say that because he wasn't in the neighborhood like a good boy, his father wasn't able to find him, and she died wondering where her son was and why he didn't love her enough to be there. Aaron yelled again that it wasn't true, that it couldn't be, but it struck him so badly he was failing to hold back his tears. Michael and I started trying our best to console him, not really knowing how. But then the mood changed on a dime when the unknown voice stopped crying and started laughing. Then, it didn't sound like the ghost of a woman anymore, but a snickering boy. We looked over and saw someone crawling out of their hiding spot behind a gravestone. It was somebody we knew, but I can't say his name. He was a couple years older than us, and he was the neighborhood bully. He must have seen us sneaking off and followed us so he could pull some kind of prank like this for kicks. All of Aaron's sadness turned into anger in an instant as he charged toward the bully, who was laughing so hard he didn't notice how pissed off Aaron was. Nobody expected him to do what he did next. Aaron tackled the boy to the ground and started beating on him, screaming furiously that it was way too far to joke about someone's sick mother dying. Michael and I agreed, and we hated being bullied by this kid too, so we let it happen, figuring it would teach the jerk a lesson. Unfortunately, we didn't notice before it was too late that Aaron wasn't just pounding the kid in the face with his fists, but with the chunk of gravestone he'd broken off a few minutes prior. After just a few more seconds, there was no sound or movement from the bully, no indication at all that he was still fighting back. Michael and I exchanged a worried look right before deciding that this in fact was going too far and we needed to stop it. We rushed over to Aaron and pulled him off the bully. As we held him back, We looked down at the other kid and saw just how badly he'd been beaten. The jagged stone had turned his face into an unrecognizable bloody mess. There were deep gashes all over his face and head. Even in the darkness, we knew, but we still waited for him to get up, or to at least groan in pain, but he never did. Gradually, Aaron let go of his rage and he came to realize what he had done. Michael and I were already stunned. He broke away from us, but then he rushed back in a panic, trying to wake the kid up by shaking and yelling his name, but none of it was any good. He finally looked back at us and he asked us to say that he was just unconscious and not dead. Only one of us knew how to check. I could see that Michael was shaking as he stepped to the body and knelt down, checking for a pulse. He checked and waited, even bringing his ear down to his face to check for breathing, but unfortunately, he only confirmed the worst. Aaron had killed our neighborhood bully. After an internal silence, Aaron snapped us out of our daze. He took charge of the moment and he led us through the cover-up. We all thought about just coming clean, but we were so afraid of the repercussions. Well, Aaron was, and there was a small sick part of us that was glad that it happened, to be honest. The bully got what he deserved, to a certain extent. We did our best to think so anyways. Besides, we had no idea how to act in a situation like that, so we just listened to the orders that we heard. We dragged the body to the fence around the drainage pond and ripped the bottom of the chain link fence out of the dirt so we could pull the body under to the other side. Then we got a gravestone and a bunch of broken chunks and threw them over, including the ones we thought we were going to be souvenirs for the night. We took off his shoes and his jeans, then slid a gravestone underneath his shirt, fastening it to his chest by tying his jeans around his torso. Then we tied his shoes to his ankles and we filled them with stones. Aaron then dragged the body into the pond, and he was holding it up until he was neck deep. Then he pushed it towards the center and let go. We watched it sink as Aaron turned around and came out of the water, looking like a completely different person. Aaron's clothes needed to dry at least a little bit so we didn't look obviously drenched before we went back to the neighborhood. And we needed to make sure that the body wouldn't immediately float to the surface, so after throwing everything related to the killing in the pond and washing our hands of the blood, we hopped the fence and sat on the banks for a while where we couldn't be seen. It was totally silent the entire time. The bloodstains had been rinsed out of his clothes, but we would never be able to look at Aaron without seeing them. It was on our hands now too, and we had to live with that. It was hard to pretend to be a normal kid after that twisted coming of age moment. The disappearance was a talk of the town for days, even weeks, until the body finally floated to the surface a few weeks later and the murder was discovered. Nobody ever suspected us, but the publicity of the case going unsolved was torturous for us all, and the worst for Aaron. Michael and I were able to get back to a semblance of normal after a couple of years, but Aaron was never the same. When his mother finally died, he never talked to us again, and he never made any other friends. He kind of became the town degenerate, and nobody but Michael and I knew the real reason why. When he was 17, he ran away from home, and he's never been seen or heard from since. This happened in the late fall when I was in my junior year of high school. I skipped school this day as I told my mom I wasn't feeling well. I most definitely exaggerated when I told her I was sick. I wasn't physically sick, I just really wasn't feeling the best that day in general, and I really wanted to skip school. Fast forward to the middle of the day, probably around noon, I heard this creepy high-pitched laughter that sounded like it was coming from outside. At first I just assumed it was our neighbor, but as the laughing continued, I couldn't help but feel creeped out. I worked myself up and I started to get this weird feeling inside, almost like something bad was about to happen. I made my way over to my window and peeked outside through the blinds, and right away I saw an older lady standing right before me, literally within 3 inches away. I basically screamed in fear. "What do you want?" I asked. She had this disturbing perplexed look on her face and this distinct smile that I will never forget. The only thing separating us was the glass window. I then moved my head away from the window and closed my blinds. This all happened in a matter of 10 seconds or less. I walked out of the room and attempted to gather my thoughts. I called my mom and she said I better wait on calling the police and to call them if the lady gives me any more problems. I went back to my room and I looked out the window again and she was gone. I felt an immense amount of relief after that. I knew I wasn't 100% in the clear though. I looked through all the windows in the house just to make sure she wasn't on our property anywhere else. And to my luck, thankfully, she didn't appear to be anywhere. The rest of the day went on just fine, and nothing more of the old lady came about. But a few days later, on Saturday night, it was around 11 o'clock I assume, I frighteningly jumped out of my seat when I heard someone knocking on my window. Right away, my first thought was that the old lady was back. I yelled out to her and told her to go away. I didn't even look out the window this time. She then started laughing again. I then yelled at her loud enough to wake my parents apparently, because my dad rushed over to my room and asked me what was going on. By now, the laughing and knocking had completely stopped, and I was too scared to explain, so I just pointed at the window and put my finger up to my lips, implying that we needed to be quiet. My dad confusingly walked over to my window and opened the blinds. He was met with the same woman that I saw a few days earlier. She began screaming at us, and she reached behind herself to grab a knife and started flashing it all around at us. This woman was screaming at the top of her lungs, but we had no idea what the hell she was saying. She then opened the window and tried to climb through the window, but because of her old age, she couldn't get herself up in time before my dad pushed her back and shut and locked the window. We called the police, and surprisingly enough, the old woman was still on our property when they arrived. It's my understanding that she rolled her ankle pretty bad and wasn't able to walk much by herself. I think she just gave up and accepted defeat and that she was going to be arrested. She told the police that she was going to kill us, and she unraveled her entire plan to the officer in an interrogation at the station. The most disturbing thing to me about this story is that this woman had to have been around 70 years old. Crime doesn't have an age limit, I guess, and neither does the horrible things that human beings can do. It's quite clear that she was clinically insane, and my presumption, without a doubt, was correct, that she was elderly and losing her mind. Apparently, she had been living next door in a house that was foreclosed that we thought was completely unoccupied. We had only been living in our home for 2 months tops when all of this happened, and there's no telling how long she had been really living in that house. She told police she was there for a few weeks, but we never got much more information than that. It's disturbing to think how long she had been planning this for, and how things could have went a lot differently if it weren't for my dad. I make sure to check that my window was locked now, more than I'd like to admit. I finally bought my first house when I was 28 years old. It was in a rough part of town and considerably not the safest neighborhood to live in. You definitely get what you pay for, and I learned my lesson with that. Within my first month of living there, nothing out of the ordinary happened at all, and I was definitely getting settled in, and I thought that I could get used to it, you know, like living there. But all that changed quickly. I met the neighbors, and I would have quick, lighthearted small talk with them here and there, but nothing more. Everyone surprisingly seemed quite normal, despite the neighborhood that we were in. Of course, there was just one guy that was an oddball out of the few. He lived a couple houses down in a pretty small and beat-up looking house, even more beat up than the others, including mine. He was probably around 45 years old, I'd say, and he always gave me the heebie-jeebies from the exact second I first laid eyes on him. He was average height, a bit overweight, and barely had any hair, and almost always wore the same rather dirty-looking clothes. He tried speaking with me a number of times, and even though I wasn't very interested in talking to him, I let him rant to me a handful amount of separate times, and he would chat my ears off about the most random and quite unusual things. There was something very off-putting about him. For example, one time I got home from the grocery store and he was walking on the sidewalk towards his house, and he stopped and turned around when I pulled into the driveway and he began talking to me. He started talking about his dead mother and how he hated her and how she was a horrible woman. He seemed very angry and was almost yelling while he was telling me this. Another time, I was sitting on my porch with one of my buds, and he saw us sitting outside and practically invited himself over, and he cut me off while I was talking, and he began yelping about something that happened to him at work. He was a dishwasher at some restaurant, and he was telling us both about how he hates it there and wants to quit. He then started making racist comments about some of the workers there. It was at this point I didn't care about being nice anymore, and I walked inside and signaled to my friend Brendan to come inside with me. I shut and locked the door behind us, and I peeked out my living room window, and thankfully he was walking away. Brendan and I were so bewildered about what had just happened that we started laughing uncontrollably because it was just so weird. Fast forward to later that night, Brendan had too many drinks, so we thought it would be best for him to crash at my place for the night. I had him sleep on the couch because the guest bedroom didn't have a bed in the room yet. At some point in the night, as I was lying in bed, probably about to drift off to sleep soon, I heard a knock on the front door. I looked through the peephole and I saw that it was the same creepy guy that never seemed to leave me alone. My instinct was to ignore it, but my buddy Brendan said, "Maybe you should just open it, bro, to see what he wants." I kind of sighed, but the man seemed to be afflicted, so I thought the right thing to do would be to open the door and see what he wanted. What he was asking for completely threw me off guard and quite honestly angered me immensely. He asked me for $50. I looked at him like he was crazy and I told him no, that I didn't have $50 lying around to just give out. He said okay and apologized for asking, and I thought that was going to be the end of it, so I attempted to shut the door, and he reached out and put his arm between the door and leaned up against it. "Wait, if you don't have any money, can you at least help me out with something? Like food, it could be anything. Just some sort of snack or something that will get me by for the rest of the night, please." I thought about helping him, but I was over this guy's games, and I didn't have much food to offer anyways. And with it being 11 o'clock at night, I was already pretty bothered by the whole situation in general, so I looked him dead in the eyes and I firmly told him no and that he needed to leave. I figured I wasn't obligated to feed this man, nor was I obligated to even speak with him if I didn't want to. I went to shut the door again, and that's when he bursted through and tackled me. Brendan got up immediately and pulled him off of me, and the man ended up running away. He probably realized he was outnumbered and didn't stand a chance in a fight with us. When you left, I saw that he had a gun tucked in his pants on his back side, and I couldn't believe it. Was this man going to try and rob me, or kill me or something? At this point, something told me that he was wanted by the police because I told a neighbor about what happened a few days later and she was shocked. And then she shocked me even more because when I told her about the guy and what happened, she said that nobody lived in that house and that it had been abandoned ever since before she lived there, which was over 5 years at the time. I called the police and they found nothing in the home, or around it, outside that would give the slightest clue as to what was going on. I think that he was most definitely squatting there for a place to live. I still to this day haven't heard anything regarding the situation that happened to me, and I can't say for sure what would have happened had I been alone that night. I don't live in that house anymore, and I've been moved out for 3 years now. I had just graduated high school, and I was 18 years old. I had been saving up money for almost a full year to finally get into my own apartment. My dad co-signed for me, and I was ready to be on my own. The rent was reasonably priced, and I was going to have my own space. The apartment was only a short walk away from the college I was about to be a freshman at the time, so a lot of the tenants were students that went to the same school. I met a couple of friends that shared similar interests, and we would hang out from time to time. There was this one guy, though, who always seemed weird. None of us knew who he was, but we always seemed to see him, it felt like, no matter what we were doing. He would ride around on his bike every day, and we would always run into him one way or another. He would stare at us very menacingly, and we kind of wrote him off as a neighborhood creep. One night when I was soft asleep, I woke up in the dead of night to sounds of yelling and screaming. The walls were paper thin, and that's why I could hear what was going on so well. It was very clear to me that it was coming from the apartment next to mine. My neighbor was a woman that was around my age, and all I could hear was her telling someone to leave over and over again. My first instinct was to knock on the door myself and see if I could be of any help to the girl. But the screaming died down shortly after, and I thought it was none of my business, and it was best to stay out of it. I somehow managed to fall back asleep, and when I woke up in the morning around 8 o'clock, I had this sinking feeling in my chest that something was wrong. I made my way over to my neighbor's apartment and knocked on the door, and finally, after knocking 4 or 5 times and waiting forever, someone finally opened the door. They only cracked it open just a bit. just enough for them to peek their eye out and for me to see a small part of their head. It was dark in there, unusually dark, so I couldn't really make out who I was talking to. "Hey, everything alright in there?" I asked. The guy quickly grew defensive and asked me what I was talking about. I told him to cut the crap, and I straight up told him I heard what happened last night with all the yelling and screaming. He immediately shut the door and told me he had no idea what I was talking about. Very angrily, I made my way back to my apartment trying to figure out what I should do. I figured there was nothing I could do. I thought it was most definitely too late to call the police, so in a flurry, I decided to go back to my neighbor's apartment with the idea in my head that I was going to demand answers. I just had such a horrible feeling, and I couldn't just not do something about it. I knocked on the door once again, and the same person answered the door, this time much faster, and they opened it all the way. I was puzzled when I saw that it was the same creepy guy my friends and I always see around the neighborhood. "Dude, where's the girl?" "Huh?" he said. "I don't know." I told him that I needed him to stop lying and that I needed answers. I then smelled this horrible foul smell that was leaking out of the apartment. I told him that I knew the girl that lived there and that I wanted to see her to make sure she was okay. He told me I was crazy and he shut the door once again. I was so frustrated at this point that I began kicking the door. I don't know if I was attempting to break in or not, it was just all sort of a blur when it happened. I was just so angry. The only thing I could do was call the police and tell them everything I knew, so that's exactly what I did. Police showed up and they demanded entry, and what they discovered is next level unimaginable. They found the girl whose name was Kaylee, and her body was all chopped up with her arms, legs, and even her head completely dismembered from her body. I'm lucky I didn't have to see that, but ever since that day, my guilty conscience has been eating at me. There is not a single day that goes by that I don't think about this and beat myself up for what happened. Knowing I could have potentially saved her life is what hurts the most. The amount of shame I've felt and carried with me for the past 5 years has consumed me and completely changed me as a person. The man who killed her is now sitting in prison, by the way, and received a death sentence for what he had done. When I was 15, I was looking for a new PlayStation on Craigslist. I've always heard that Craigslist could be sketchy, but it was the cheapest place I knew of that I could get my hands on one. My PS4 had broken a few days prior, so I really wanted a new one as soon as possible. As I was browsing through listings, I saw one that caught my eye. The price the guy was asking for it seemed pretty low. Almost too good to be true low. But as I said before, I was desperate at this point, so I went ahead and contacted the seller. We had arranged to meet up later that day. Nothing seemed to be weird just yet. However, when it came around time to meet, just 30 minutes before, he asked me if we could reschedule to a few hours later than we originally planned. I said sure, but I was a little annoyed at this point because it was already 5 p.m. and I'm from the Midwest. It was also winter, so it's pretty much pitch black by 7 p.m. I decided to just say screw it and meet up with him a few hours later. I told my parents I was going to the store and I would be back in a few. I knew if I told them what I was doing, there's no way in hell they would let me go. I know that was wrong of me to lie, but I was a dumb teenager. What can I say? Anyways, on my way there I got this intense gut feeling, like something was wrong. At this point it was like 8:30 p.m, so it didn't help that it was extremely dark outside. I live in a slightly rural area, so that kind of added to the eeriness if I'm being honest. After a moment of driving, I received a notification on my phone. It was a text from him. I don't remember his name, so I'll just call him George from now on. He was asking me if I could just come to his house instead of meeting at the park like we had talked about previously. Immediately, I knew in my heart something was off. I just really wanted the PS4, and I was already upset that he delayed our meetup. And I didn't want to come back empty-handed and drive all that way for nothing. I made the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life by going to his house that night. When I got there, the vibe was off. I can't explain how I felt, but the way I was feeling was something I've never experienced. Being the dumb, naive 15-year-old I was, I proceeded to knock on the door. The house looked really old and it was dimly lit up. Almost no light at all coming from the house. Like I said before, this was in a pretty rural area, so there weren't many other houses around. On my way up to the porch to knock on the door, I started to second guess myself. Like maybe I should just turn around. I don't know why, but I didn't. I really wish I would have though. I'm not going to lie to you, at this point I'm shitting bricks. I knocked on the door ever so lightly. He opened the door almost immediately with the PS4 in his hand and introduced himself. It was like he was waiting there for me or something. He asked if I'd like to come inside and see him turn the PS4 on and that everything works properly before I buy it. I sat there briefly in silence for just a moment. I stuttered, no thanks, I'm good. He gave me a kind of a weird look, like I maybe offended him or something. I gave him the money and he handed me the PS4 and some extra stuff that came with it in a box, like games, a controller, and all the cords it needed. He asked me if I was sure that I didn't want to come inside and check that it works before I take off. I told him that I really had to get home because my parents have a curfew for me and I'll be in big trouble if I'm not home on time. After I said that, he had this dark and evil look in his eyes. It was a good thing I was standing 6 feet or more away from him because he quickly reached out for my arm and tried to grab me and pull me inside. I immediately dodged his attempt and took off running and screaming to my car. I swear I've never ran faster than that in my entire life. Despite running fast, it felt like forever before I got to my car. I had to run down steps and it was dark, so I had to be careful I didn't fall. He was an older man and relatively out of shape. I assumed that just from looking at him. So I didn't think he could catch me. But still, my heart was racing so fast I thought I was going to have a heart attack. The whole way to my car he was screaming at me, calling me every name in the book, and said I was lucky that I got away, otherwise I'd be in his basement right now pleading for help. Like you deserve, he said. When I got in the car, he was only halfway to me. I took off so quick and never looked back. Come to think of it now, I don't think that was really his house. It had to be abandoned or something. Either way, I don't know and I don't care. I'm just happy I'm okay. I still have nightmares about this quite frequently. I've never told anyone about this before, nor will I ever. Especially not my parents. They would kill me. Anyways, I learned a lesson that night that I'll never forget. I really needed some extra money when I was a teenager a few years back, so I looked online at Craigslist for some opportunities to potentially make some money. I wasn't really expecting anything to come out of it at all, actually. It was just the morbid curiosity of that I might have been able to strike gold and find something good. What I found was an ad that said they needed someone to help with some yard work. It caught my eye because the person who posted the ad was in the same city as me and only a few miles away. I knew this because I live in a small town, and I mean really small. No more than 10,000 people live here. It said they would pay $150 for around 2 to 3 hours of work. I immediately jumped to it and contacted him. He said he was too old to be doing this type of work and that he really appreciates me coming out to help him. He seemed like a good man and very nice over the phone, so I didn't think much of it. He asked if I could come out the next morning and I said of course. I told my mom what I was doing and where I was going and she was okay with it. Slightly concerned, but she was okay with it. I have my own cell phone, so if anything were to go wrong, I could call someone immediately for help. Everyone in the town where I live are very nice and friendly people anyways. Almost no crime here at all, and generally a safe area. Everyone knows everyone here. Any sort of crime is almost completely unheard of. Anyways, when I got there the following day and I met the man I was helping out for the day, who we'll call Bob, everything seemed pretty normal. He showed me what he wanted me to do. He explained he wanted me to rake up some leaves in the front yard, pick up some sticks and debris, and pull the weeds out of his mulch/garden bed and driveway, and all around the house as well. He explained that he had everything I needed for the job, and that I can use his tools. He gave me gloves, a rake, some yard waste bags, and an empty garbage can. We made small talk for a moment, but then he started asking me a lot of questions. Nothing weird at first. He asked me how old I was, where I was from, and what my name was. I proceeded to tell him my name and that I was from the same town just a few miles down the road. That's when everything took a sharp turn. He started asking me some very strange personal questions that I don't even feel comfortable sharing right now. I will let you take that how you decide. Just know they were not appropriate questions to be asking a 16-year-old whom you just met. I was very short with him and told him I needed to get to work because I have to be home by a certain time. He walked away and I began the job. He seemed very angry at this point and I didn't understand why. I thought about leaving because I was so uncomfortable about what just happened, but I was also too anxious to leave at the same time. I'm not sure why, but I stayed and finished the job. It took me about 2 hours to complete. It was really weird because through the whole time I was working, I would catch him staring at me here and there through multiple different windows, sometimes with this very creepy smile on his face, almost condescending in a way. In my head, I was thinking, what the hell is wrong with this man? But I had already showed up, started the job, and I wanted my money. So I completed it like I said. When I was finished, I grabbed everything he let me borrow and put it on his front porch. I knocked on the door to let him know I was finished with the job. He handed me $120 and told me to get out of here in a very demanding and rude way. I stood there for a moment in shock and kind of just stared at him because I was confused. He began screaming at me and telling me to get the hell away and to get off his property. I didn't even care at that point that he didn't pay me the full $150. I was so scared that something bad was going to happen that I booked it to my car and went home. On my way to the car, he was sort of yelling at me saying he will see me soon. That if I didn't want anything bad to happen, to not tell anyone what happened. He yelled my address at me. I cannot believe the words that came out of his mouth. How in the hell did he know my address? What does he want from me? I started crying on my way home, and I mean I was hysterical. I'd never been that scared in my life. I kept looking behind me to make sure he wasn't following. He wasn't, but that didn't really help how I was feeling. I was absolutely fucking terrified. When I got home, I rushed to my bedroom and tried my best to gather my thoughts. I was too scared to tell my parents what had happened. I was worried if I did, and I got him arrested, that when he got out of jail, that he would for sure try to kidnap me or something crazy like that. I lied awake all night that night. I didn't even attempt to sleep because I was so anxious. It wasn't until maybe around 1:30 a.m. that I heard a car outside and a car door shut kind of quietly. I peeked through my window and it was him. It was the same car that was at Bob's house. I was freaking the hell out, so I ran out of my room, into my parents' room screaming, and I told them everything that was going on and that there was a man outside that was going to try and hurt me. My dad grabbed his pump shotgun and started screaming at him and threatening him. He took off, and I never seen him again after that. My parents called the police and got him arrested for harassment and attempted aggravated assault or something like that. This was over 3 years ago. But I still live in the same house, and still to this day, I have nightmares and anxiety about what happened. I don't even like staying at home alone anymore either. I hope I never see him again. I was selling my old couch on Craigslist because I had just got a new one and I didn't want my old one anymore. It wasn't in the best shape. It definitely lived its life and served its purpose. But I bought it for like $800 a few years back and expected it to be worth at the very least $250. I put it on Craigslist for $300, with the idea already in my head that I wouldn't take anything less than $200. I had some people reach out to me, but I'm sure you know that if you've ever sold something online before, people like to be flaky when it comes to buying stuff online. They will message you and seem interested and just ghost you. Anyways, I had people reach out to me, but no one serious until maybe just over a week after posting my ad on Craigslist. I received a call from a guy. He told me his name was Jim. He said he would like to come look at the couch and wanted to know if he could stop by later tonight when he gets off work. I told him that would not be a problem, so I gave him my address. Not even an hour after that, he showed up to my house. I heard a knock on my door, wondering who it was because Jim wasn't supposed to be here for another 3 hours or so. I looked through my peephole to see if I recognized who was knocking. I didn't recognize the man at all. Hello? Who are you? I asked him in a very weary tone. Hi, it's Jim. I talked to you on Craigslist about the couch. I know I'm a bit early. I probably should have called. I'm sorry. I cracked my door open with a slight concern on my face. Okay, I said. I opened the door all the way and told him to come on in. He looked at the couch and asked if I would take $150 for it. I told him no, the lowest I could do is $200. He seemed a bit irritated by that, but the couch was worth more than $150. I mean, I'm sure if I waited long enough, I could sell it to someone else for $250 to $300. He said okay, and that he could do $200. He asked if he could use my bathroom real quick because he has a long drive home. I told him that I didn't mind and pointed him to the bathroom. Right then and there, I had this weird feeling like something was wrong. I told myself I was just being anxious and ridiculous, so I tried not to think much of it. When he came back out of the bathroom, it was like his whole personality changed. I'm not exaggerating. He seemed like a whole new person. The face he was making, the way he was talking, and his tone of voice all changed. He said, "Look, you're gonna give me the goddamn couch for $150 or I'm gonna take it from you." Before he even had time to finish his sentence, 2 more guys came through my front door with knives in their hand and headed towards us by the couch. I started freaking out and begged them not to hurt me and that they can have the couch and I won't call the cops and to please leave. I told them I have a family and I don't want anyone getting hurt and that they can just have the couch. I must have repeated myself at least 10 times in a frantic cry. I was absolutely terrified. They took the couch and I never called the cops because I have a wife and 2 sons that I love deeply, and I worry about their safety more than anything. We were renting that house, so we decided to look for another place to live because of what happened. In the last 5 months of living there, I never seen them again, and hopefully I never have to.